If you think architecture is worth doing, as I say to youngsters, the first 5 years are the toughest. It is a struggle to survive, but it's worth it. It's like the test of whether you've got the energy for it.
Simon Allford is an architect and the co-founder of renowned practice Allford Hall, Monaghan Morris, a London-based studio known for its public and private work, treated with commercial acumen and considered design. Alongside practice, he supported the next generation of architects as a visiting professor at Harvard and the trustee of the London School of Architecture. Simon served as the RIBA president from 2021 to 23, focusing on organisational reform and improving the relationship between architects, clients and the public. He led the House of Architecture initiative, an online and physical resource for the profession, including the renovation of the RIBA's home at Portland Place, which is now underway. The infamous Simon Allford quote of "First we storm the building, then we take back the asylum." Where did that come from?
So I've always been a fan of architecture first, the profession second, and the RIBA third. It was like, what is this institute doing? It needs to become focused on architecture. That is its charter, architecture, not the service of architects.
What was the hardest thing?
The hardest thing was, I don't want to upset my colleagues and friends, I've taught for many years in many places, but...
Simon, thank you so much for joining me.
Nice to be here.
You grew up with an architect as a father. What was that experience like, and what was that moment in your childhood that made you realise that maybe you wanted to be an architect?
I would say it was more in my teenage years. I grew up with a father from the north, from Sheffield, and a mother from Redcar. I grew up in London, but I was always told you're a northern lad. And looking back, I spent a lot of time, we'd go off and look at buildings and sites and stuff and visit things at the weekend. He also built a house in the country that we call the Cottage. It was actually a modern brutalist box. It was surrounded by architects, but I wasn't particularly interested. I was interested in football.
Sure.
Sheffield Wednesday, we lost 1-0 at Millwall last night, but that's the way of the world. So I wanted to be a footballer. That was my thing. So I was about 16, 17. I was doing my A-levels. I was doing English, history and maths. I don't want to do maths. I'm not good enough. English and history, I enjoy. I like writing. I like reasoning. I like constructing ideas. But I really don't think I want to be told which books to read and work my way through those books. So I just decided, I always drew, I did art. I'll become an architect. And I just said to him at 17, I think I'm going to become an architect. He said, really? Are you sure? Do you want to do that? You'll certainly never work for me, in a nice way. And I was like, no, I want to do it, and I'll see how it goes. And I went away to Sheffield, back to my family's roots, and sort of discovered it again, on my own terms, away from him. He was very involved with practice. I grew up knowing he'd built Gatwick Airport. There was a bit of a revelation in the first year when there was a series of lectures. They talked about the post-war rebuilding of Britain. I realised all the people they were talking about, the Smithsons, Archigram, Cedric Price, Frank Newby, were all his very, very close friends. Frank Newby used to go to Sheffield Wednesday with us because he came from Barnsley, he's a famous engineer. So, I suddenly made a connection that actually I was more steeped in architecture than I realised. But that's quite a good thing, because it wasn't... I have other friends who are sort of steered into it, whereas I sort of discovered it.
Sure. And discovered a deeper relationship with it.
Exactly.
Sort of
and I still make connections now. I'm seeing someone next week who worked for my father 40 years ago. When I was president, someone wrote to me, a Sri Lankan, saying how he'd employed him and he was nervous and Dad had talked to him about cricket. So I now enjoy the connection. Of course, when we set up in practice, people asked if I was related to him. I used to joke only distantly.
Right.
Because I didn't want to be my father's son. Yeah,
sure.
I never want to play on that card or be associated with him. Now, of course, I'm quite happy I'm actually in Sheffield with Urban Splash. I'm working on the kind of reinvention of a Grade 2 listed department store, iconic department store called Cole Brothers, which he designed.
Right.
So, so there's a bit of fun in that.
Yeah, there's something lovely about that. Was there ever part of the industry that you saw in his experience that you wanted to come away from?
No, I must admit that he lived life quite large. So, I saw it as going for breakfast. His office was in Britain Street, and I used to go to breakfast with him at 7:00 in the Meat Porter's pub. So, in a way, I thought life looked quite good, actually.
Yeah.
There was kind of
Something
lunches
attractive about
and,
that.
Yeah, exactly. It all looked quite glamorous. I think it's quite important, actually, to make life enjoyable, because architecture's tough enough. You have to kind of have some fun along the way.
Agreed. So in those early days, you just mentioned about setting up AHMM. So you set up very early in your career with 3 other partners. Tell me about that moment when you met at university and that sort of spark that was created that maybe led you to where you are, something that made you appreciate the others, that there was something worth moving forward with them.
It was a kind of... So I went to Sheffield with Paul Monaghan, and we were mates, and then we came to London and shared a house. In fact, he worked at YRM for my father.
Okay, right.
I worked for Nicholas Grimshaw, which is a tiny office. He worked for a very large office at the time, YRM. And Jonathan and Pete were in Bristol, and they lived together, and they came to London with Mike Taylor, who's a senior partner at Hopkins. So kind of small, coincidental, connected worlds, which I think is always the case. So we all went to the Bartlett. So they're at Bristol, we're at Sheffield. We all met at the Bartlett. We were the outsiders, because the Bartlett was a little club. We were the only people. Now everyone moves. In those days, we were the only people who came from somewhere else and moved. So we sort of naturally, I suppose we were slightly more adventurous than we'd bothered to move. And we were slightly more
You were looking for something,
ambitious. We were looking for something, and we were enjoying living and working in London. And so we naturally kind of did things together in the studio in the space in the 4th year of our, first year of our diploma. Then in the 5th year, the project was a supermarket. And I think it was actually probably quite a good project, but we thought it was terrible. So we said we didn't want to do it, and we'd do our own project. And we invented a project called The Fifth Man, which was about 4 people collaborating. It was the big bang in the city. It was a time of great change. So we sort of said function wasn't the driving force. It was about making a place in the city, and we took a site at Little Britain, and we worked together on a master plan where we each had our own building, but it was wrapped around a public space. And we used to do kind of what were then novel techniques, like we'd draw our buildings on our own, then collage them together using the Xerox machine. And so there's an idea that you worked individually and collectively, never just collectively, which we always thought was a compromise. So you owned your project, but you adjusted your project as you would with neighbouring historical buildings. You adjusted it because of the neighbouring buildings being designed by your peers. So that project, The Fifth Man, our diploma, that sort of brought us all together. And then we had a tutor, John Corp, who we still see, who was kind of a larger-than-life character, who suggested you go out and get a job as 4. So it's a very different time to now. It was 1986. We used to have a joke, if you had a pencil, you could get work.
Okay.
They were importing architects from New Zealand. Anyway, we ended up, got quite a few offers, but individually and collectively. But we ended up working for a guy called Bill Jack, who was the chairman of Building Design Partnership, because he had just formed a very interesting relationship with Jeremy Dixon to do the Opera House. And he said, I think you 4 guys can work for me as a sort of tool within BDP to do special projects. And we had a brilliant 3 years. We weren't always working together for BDP, but we did do things together. And we were also working for him. I gave a speech at his memorial recently. It was a long, powerful connection. But in the evenings, we were doing competitions. And eventually, I think we just got qualified. I was just 27. And we were like, either we stay and build buildings or we go before we're earning any proper money and get out and open a practice. So we decided one night in the pub to open a practice and kind of resigned the next day. We gave them plenty of warning, 3 months, because they'd been good to us. We want to be good to them. So it was one of those kind of naive, optimistic moments. We'd done very well in some of these competitions. I'd won one for Building Design, West Pier, Brighton. We'd come second, first, second, and another one for Birmingham. There were 3 sites. So we'd done really, really well. And we thought, the world's busy, let's open an office. It was 1989. It was about the worst possible time to do that. But in a way, I always say, if you open an office in a bad time, by God, you learn quickly. If you open at a good time, you get a shock down the line.
It's amazing to have that sort of that early career agency sort of thing, and also have, I guess, some level of security from that mentorship.
Yeah, we knew lots of people. We knew lots of architects. We were connected to the next generation, like Allies and Morris, and we became very friendly early on with Glenn Howells in Birmingham. So you became, Eric Parry was a bit older than us, but there's a group of people who you knew and could talk to, who could swap notes with. And people are still baffled now when you win or lose a competition. I'm like, well, don't you realize we all know each other? We all, if you lose to someone who's good, you're disappointed to lose, but at least it's someone who's good. So we all grew up together, and everyone's always been supportive. And I think that's quite a good tradition in architecture. People are always happy to swap notes and are quite, generous with each other. I mean, with hindsight, it was terrible, and you wouldn't have done it. But again, with hindsight, actually, if you hadn't have done it then, you might never have done it. So, I think fate does determine certain things.
Completely. And after that point of jumping, was there a moment of realization of this is going to be harder than we thought?
We had a soft landing because BDP were very good to us and commissioned us to do some projects for them from our office, which is the most expensive office, at the time, £30 above Pizza Express on Charlotte Street. We were around the corner from them. They gave us work. So for the first 18 months, it was actually quite good. And we were advertising in the Ham and High for loft extensions, doing competitions, and earning some consultancy fees from them. And then 1989, 90, 91, it all got very, very tricky. All the consultancy dried up. The competitions, you might win them, but they never generated work. And actually, you might not win them. It was almost, a pretty barren time. We were teaching, we were doing lots of other things. All the money you earned, I say all the money, there wasn't very much, but whatever you earned went into the practice. I remember our accountant saying to us, when we set up, the best thing you lads could do is while you're on your current salaries, get yourself a gold card. So we had these gold cards because you're on decent salaries at BDP. And at one stage, we were putting them in the wall, drawing out cash on the gold card on credit and paying that into the bank to deal with our debt. So it was a pretty bad model. Jonathan Hall, who deals with legals now and money, he was a big gambler. And we used to say to him, look, let's put some money on the horses. He felt it was too much pressure. So there was lots of, when you look back, fun stories about survival. But at the time,
that's the hindsight,
it was pretty hand to mouth, and you had to believe you were going to survive, which is why I always say to a young practice, if you can get through the first 5 years, you're likely to survive. It's not just the 5 years because suddenly you'll have a name and a reputation. It's almost like, have you got the energy and the will
to go through that,
to graft through those 5 years?
And did you ever feel like, obviously as a four, that's a lot of mouths to feed. That's already as a collective, that's, a number of salaries, a number of people, but also I suppose it is a number of opportunities at the same thing. You're all pulling in different directions with all your own connections as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the rule was, and it still is, anything you earn anywhere goes into the business. And that's quite a good rule because it stops people sort of having sideline jobs.
Yeah.
I mean, a mate of mine was a graphic designer. He found his business partner was going for interviews for jobs elsewhere. I mean, you've got to sort of be all in it together. So we were always all in it together. And we sort of drew out money according to our needs. So if someone had slightly different expenses or whatever to their life, it was all tallied up, and one day it would all be leveled out, which it was. So there was a kind of collaborate. We're all in it. We're all equal. No one's subsidizing anyone. We're all working to pull this thing off. And there was four mouths, but there was also 4 people to be at different rooms at different times, meeting different people and different personalities working in different ways. So it kind of proved to be a success, but the success was never guaranteed. The only thing that held us together, I mean, again, the same accountant who told us to get gold cards said, basically, lads, you're insolvent and always have been. That was in year 4. Yeah, we'd always been making a loss, but a managed small debt loss, 50,000 quid or whatever it was.
Well, I suppose that thing about the collaborative thing, it's a bit like a band saying all songs are written by all of us sort of thing. It's that collective thing rather than picking and choosing. I think I was even taught at university about AHMM and about the different partners having different skill sets, and that was a really positive thing to find people around you that had different skill sets. And obviously in the way the practice works now, there is the two kind of design studios, and your other two partners have different responsibilities. Was that always clear from the start? Because obviously you all started as architects in university sort of thing.
Yeah. It wasn't necessarily clear that way we thought wasn't clear would become a very large practice.
Yeah,
Lots of things weren't clear. I think the key thing is when we worked together, as I mentioned earlier, we worked each on an individual building, but in a collective city space and place. And we never designed buildings together. Someone always had the lead on a project. The others, so professionally and published wise, it's owned by the firm.
Sure.
So you don't say by X of AHMM. Any AHMM building is by AHMM. But internally, someone was responsible for that. You could design review it, you could talk to them about it, you could engage with it, but they made the ultimate decisions because we always feared a collaboration dragging everyone down to the lowest common denominator. So the sort of golden rule was if everyone likes what you're doing, it may not be very good. And in a way, people being a bit uncomfortable as you might be pushing one thing or another is actually a good thing, and that the individual should own it, but for the collective kind of well-being, just like the financial thing, the architectural thing is, it's not a building by me or Paul, it's a building by AHMM, and obviously increasingly by people within AHMM working under our sort of studio umbrella. But it's very much the idea that it's a competition, but not a negative competition. So we're not competing for the same job, but we're competing to learn from each other
So
to do things
together.
To do things better.
Did the other two naturally fall into the more technical or commercial or monetary side of things?
Well, Peter Morris was always a strategist, and I think I suggested he did a course at Cranfield, and he did a sort of MBA in running an architect studio. So that was his sort of introduction to being MD. Jonathan Hall, he always had a very, very particular kind of science, physics, maths brain. Quite a literary person too, but his wife was an architect who became a construction law barrister. So he had a natural understanding of, in fact, even now, if you go to see lawyers, he'll say, well, I was thinking, shouldn't we think about it a bit? I can see them thinking, Christ, he doesn't tell people what to do, but by God, he knows his stuff. So naturally, they gravitated to places where they could best help the making of architecture. And there is a kind of saying we have about everyone, whether you're a receptionist, kind of document manager, librarian, you're helping to make architecture. That is the fundamental reason why you might enjoy being there for the time you're there. You're helping to make architecture. Therefore, when a building is completed, we do building tours. Lots of people from the office go, not just the architects, because it's a collective endeavour.
Do you think that's one of the reasons that AHMM have been so successful is because of that understanding about business of architecture, the business of practice, the understanding that it's just as important to push this thing as the sort of design side?
We were always interested in general practice. When we gave a Young Lions lecture at the RIBA, we joked that specialisation was, everyone said you must be a specialist. It's still like that in America. And our view was we've studied for 5 years. We've done 2 years of professional exams. And then we're sort of narrowing ourselves down to one field. And actually, if you think architecture is worth doing, it should be done at all scales in all kinds of places. And another professor from the Bartlett, David Dunster, he'd always talked about Aldo Rossi and the background buildings of the city. And the focus at the early stage of our career was very much on the foreground buildings, the sort of great public institutions. Sure. And we were always saying, well, actually, architecture must exist in all situations as a kind of, almost like a kind of social activity. And therefore, we never tied ourselves down to a particular field. We always thought our expertise was to make buildings and solve complex problems, make the complex legible. So that sort of drove our thinking as a general view of architecture. And then because we'd struggled so much, we were bored of it, but we were always having to talk about money to survive. And I think with hindsight, that was a brilliant lesson. And that's why I said earlier, I think opening in a good time is not necessarily a good thing, because you kind of think that the gravy train will always carry on. It can be wearing opening a bad time, but I don't think we teach people enough about architecture as the broadest possible discipline. So, I don't want to upset my colleagues and friends. I've taught for many years in many places, but actually architecture is about communicating with people, understanding place, understanding the moment in time, understanding the limits of the opportunity as well as the kind of extent of the ambitions that you can have. And it's understanding how you can make that an attractive career for yourself and for others. And even, to this day, the profession will moan about money and fees and not being properly looked after. And my point is, and I've always said this, it's our own fault, because we are trained to love architecture. We are preconditioned to think, well, great architects, don't make any money and all this stuff. And therefore it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And actually, it's not a very generous prophecy, because your life without any adequate cash and continuous debt is quite miserable. And also, as a profession, who's going to be attracted into a profession that doesn't look after its people properly? So I think that is now that kind of attitude is turning, but I think it's a very powerful attitude, because historically, architects worked in local authorities. So when we, Thatcher broke up the local authorities, but when we were young architects, there were not, practices was almost a new thing, because most people went into local authorities, and then some went into the famous practices that won the famous other jobs, of which there were probably a dozen. Local authorities were very successful and important practices. Park Hill in Sheffield, that was done by a local authority practice. But that model had gone. So we were sort of at the cusp of the moment when people reinvented the profession. And there was this dreadful term that still exists, a gentleman's profession, which obviously meant you had a private income and you could cross-subsidise. And actually, that was once deemed to give you a sort of artistic integrity. I think it now kind of suggests a slightly closed profession, which I don't think architecture should be. And if it is a profession that doesn't generate wealth for people, it's not going to attract the right kind of people into it. So I think the problem lingers on, unfortunately. It's probably as difficult now as it has been, but at least the mindset is changing. People want to be looked after properly.
Yeah, it definitely feels like this generation has at least trying to grasp and take hold of that. Within your career, how much do you think the sort of the projects that you've worked on and the things that you've achieved have come from happenstance, have come from grabbing opportunities that come to you? And how much is it that drive? How much is it about direction and strategy?
I think all projects come to you through happenstance, in a sense, because you never know which projects you'll win and which ones of those you win that will actually happen. And of those that happen, which one will have that kind of magic mix of opportunity and the sort of zeitgeist to make it stand out as a project. I think the strategy was always, we are skilled at solving complex problems and making the complex legible and finding the real opportunity within the project to make something that was transformative at all kinds of scales, whether it's making us, finding a space for a desk in a section in a tiny flat, or cutting a hole in a huge building in Amsterdam to release part of the city that was disconnected. We've always been interested in the primary strategic opportunity that intelligent design could solve, and then architecture has the ability to detail, deliver, and make that somehow delightful at a human scale. So that, I think, has given us great strength because we're not trapped in a field
Sure.
or a specialisation.
I mean, one thing you could probably say about AHMM is that the majority of the projects look different, and that seems to stem from an approach rather than a stylistic choice.
Yeah, I think that I mean, projects learn from each other. Our view is architecture is a creative journey, and to straitjacket a way of making buildings look. If I'm building in the city of London, it's quite a different thing to build in the city of Amsterdam or the city of Sheffield. If I'm building in a suburb rather than a town centre, if I'm surrounded by historical buildings rather than a contemporary context, that's all an influence. The client is an influence. The budget is an influence. I think the underlying ideas in the buildings are kind of constantly evolving and interlinked. But the appearance of the building, in a way, we wanted it always to be a journey. I've done that. I've looked at the idea of wrapping a building. Now I'm going to look at the idea of expressing a frame as an exploration of architecture's potential related to the place, the time, and the opportunity.
I'm going to jump to your time as presidency, starting with this quote. So the infamous Simon Allford quote of "First we storm the building, then we take back the asylum." That was 2020 article in the AJ. Where did that come from?
So I've always been a fan of architecture first, the profession second, and the RIBA third. I think all three are important, but to me, architecture is architecture. It's made by anyone who can make architecture. So although we all study, most of us study, I've worked with people who've never studied architecture, who are highly talented architects, if not by title. I was involved for, I think, 6 years. I was vice president for education at the RIBA, from teaching at the Bartlett and at Harvard and elsewhere. And, I've always thought education is really important. I've always thought the RIBA awards are important culturally. I've always thought the collection was important. But, I had a feeling that with what was going on and the restructuring, the appointment of a non-architect chair, it was like, what is this institute doing? It needs to become focused on architecture. That is its charter, architecture, not the service of architects. And I just thought, and it's not even servicing architects, the new chairman of the board isn't even an architect. This is a kind of crazy crisis, COVID, lack of confidence. So it was a bit of a rant because I was irritated by what I read.
And then I think you went on to say that the presidency was the job you never wanted. What was the moment that convinced you to actually go for it? Was there a single conversation that you had?
No, there were a lot of emails from friends, colleagues, architects, different ages, and others saying, "You're right," and now you've said that, which was just a rant.
They're going to hold you to it.
You can't say that and not do something about it. I always thought, my old man used to joke, presidents of the RIBA are divorced or alcoholics or both. So I was never groomed or keen on it, although I thought the institute was always valuable, which is why I bothered to rant about it. So, people like Jack Pringle, former president, Paul Finch, lots of other architect mates say, you do something about it, go and do it. So I said, okay, I'll stand. I've then made my pitch. If I lose, I lose, but at least, I've followed up on the rant.
And obviously a lot of the conversations were around the RIBA as House of Architecture.
Yeah.
And I was watching a speech of yours, actually, when you finished your presidency talking about the House of Architecture. And I do find it fascinating that in this speech you speak about the collection and about the RIBA, the Portland Place as being, that place that people have that relationship with architecture, its role in talking about architecture to the wider public sort of thing. And I think obviously also in the press there is a critique of this whole House of Architecture idea, the London-centric idea as well. I mean, I find it compelling that to reinforce the idea of architecture, it is a piece of architecture in itself. Do you have that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the RIBA at its best, in the international world, the RIBA is deemed to be a gold standard institute. In our world, it's deemed to be, oh, damn the RIBA sort of thing. That's sort of inevitable. You're always a prophet in somewhere, in another land. So I think the building exists, and it is an amazing building. Commissioned in 1934. The RIBA used to be in Sketch. I didn't know that.
Okay.
That amazing restaurant bar, absurd place. That was the RIBA's headquarters on Conduit Street. They, did a deal, got the site, got a 999-year lease, built a forever building, and it's quite a monumental piece, but it's quite a Adolf Loessian-like flow of space, round plan rather than plan libre. It seemed to me that you've got the building. Who else would give up a building in central London that you paid £900 a year for in rent? Who wouldn't use it? London is a global city. We're a global institute. That is the natural physical hub, but there is a virtual hub of things like podcasts, recording lectures. So my vision was always the House of Architecture was a place of debate physically at the RIBA, but shared digitally online. And of course, all the regions and the chapters are very active. They are all connecting with each other through the RIBA as the hub and the spoke. And that's helping people. I don't think you need, a network in London, because London is a rich network. But if you're in other places slightly more isolated, the RIBA as a network can be ever more important. So, the physical place is important. The RIBA is also the collection. It's always pushed it away to the V&A and storage and everywhere else. So my point is, that is the cultural program of architecture. And the reason most of us support the RIBA is as a cultural asset, helping to drive the way we might think about architecture, can also approach government rather than us individually. It has certain strengths in that way. It doesn't control what we do as a profession. I've always said the RIBA isn't the profession. The RIBA needs to harness the profession, because the profession is a disparate suite of voices with different needs. Its best way of helping those different voices, different needs, is to promote the art of architecture, which is its charter, not to promote architects. So it needs to be broad, which is why the International Prize is open, why the Student Prize is open to schools that we don't validate. I think that's culturally really important.
And have you seen over your time, even from point of student to now, have you ever seen the value of architecture change to the general public? Do you think there is an appreciation of the buildings? Because I talk about my wife a lot and the litmus test, because she's not an architect. She is a muggle, as I refer to a normal person, and what she appreciates as architecture and what I appreciate as architecture, and they're very different things. And I always sort of wonder about this thing about what does the everyman appreciate about architecture?
I think, I started studying in 1980. I think architecture culture is always strong within the profession. I think it was very difficult when we started designing buildings in the mid-80s. Planning was trapped in a kind of architecturally invented postmodern backlash against the power of modern architecture. So the brave new world, the ripping out of the guts of cities by bombing, but then by strategic demolition and building, which was all done by people with huge social purpose and commitment. And the failures of that highlighted Thamesmead, Clockwork Orange, all these things. It gave architecture a really, really bad rep, culminating in Prince Charles' famous speech that sort of shattered the profession, and particularly ABK at the time.
Instead of designing an extension to the elegant facade of the National Gallery, which complements it and continues the concept of colours and domes, it looks as if we may be presented with a kind of vast municipal fire station, complete with a sort of tower that contains the sun. I would understand better this type of high-tech approach if you demolished the whole of Trafalgar Square and started again, with a single architect responsible for the entire layout. But what is proposed seems to me like a monstrous carbuncle on the face of a much-loved and elegant friend.
So I think the lesson, to me has always been actually the general public do embrace architecture, and that their voice is powerful. And the more you can't listen to that voice, you can hear that voice and you can respect it. And that voice isn't a single voice anyway. Someone will hate a building, someone will like a building. When I stand up a public consultation, I say, look, we believe what we're doing is good. Some of you do, some of you don't. That is what architecture is. But if the building's generous enough, it shouldn't defile the city. It should just add to it. And I think actually we're in a much stronger place. All those TV shows about house extensions, in a strange way, have brought a kind of bigger public awareness of IKEA, throw out your chintz.
Chuck out that chintz! Let's chuck out that chintz today!
All these kind of cultural moments have brought a greater public awareness of the potential of architecture, which is why, ironically, it still attracts large numbers of applications, even though it's not necessarily financially the most attractive career, as we were talking about earlier. So I think that the public voice is a multiple and varied voice, but, engaging with the public is a good thing. The idea of being away from it, protected from it, and saying, well, we know, because we're the profession and we know better, does not help you. Because even if you don't agree with what you're told, you get a feeling of what people are worried about. And then that makes you think, okay, so how might I address that concern about the streetscape or the overshadowing or whatever it might be? How might I address that in a positive way? I remember Will Alsop, who was not exactly a shrinking violet, saying, actually, I enjoy public consultation. It makes you think harder. So anything that makes you think harder is good. So we're much more engaged with the public. That's good for us. We're not doing what they want because they don't say what they want, because they're a disparate set of voices. But just that engagement is helping us. I think it's making our job more difficult and demanding. And by doing that, it makes us think harder and makes the architecture that we create have more long-term potential.
In terms of the profession, then, so we've spoken about the sort of public appearance of architecture. In terms of the profession, when you were president, what were the things that were filling up your inbox from the profession?
I think I used to really enjoy conversations on Teams, a lot of it was in COVID, with local chapters, seeing how much people were doing to bring architecture to their local schools or libraries, which is something I've always thought that if the RIBA could help people get into schools, talk about architecture, not just to find the next generation, but also to kind of broaden the public discussion, that would be a good thing. So I was always very impressed by that. What I was aware of, but, I kind of heard firsthand more, was that concern people had that they were competing with what they call the kitchen table plan drawer on domestic projects. And I said to them, look, I understand the worry you have, but if someone wants to pay someone £300 for a plan for a house extension, that person's, in the nicest possible way, they're never going to engage you. And therefore, comes back to the House of Architecture. If we are almost in a job of creating more people who might decide not to pay for a kitchen drawer, which is absolutely fine, by the way, but might choose an architect because they might see some value in it.
Because they understand that.
And they see some value in the architecture that they've seen through whatever, the Institute, through an exhibition, through television, or whatever it might be. So you expand the clients. I mean, the big thing is most buildings are not involving architects, in the history of architecture. We've only, we're a newish profession, 200 years. Most buildings don't involve architects. Most large buildings do involve architects. A lot of architects will say they're being marginalised on large buildings by other delivery vehicles. So, our job, I think, is continuously to promote to the wider world the benefits of architecture, not architects, but architecture. And where do you best get architecture from? Well, generally from architects.
Having now had some distance between your time as the RIBA president, what do you think is the thing that you're kind of, maybe what was the hardest thing, and also what's the thing that you were most proud of?
The hardest thing was internal politics amongst architects, to be frank. That was the hardest thing. And those are certain people who fixate around the RIBA and are there forever and think they're the cultural guardians, and some of them were sinisterly unpleasant. That was just, but my vow was I'm not going to have a row with anyone. I'm just going to treat everyone with respect. And if I disagree with them, all they can say is I've treated them with respect and listened to them and behaved in a proper way. The upside, the good thing is the House of Architecture, Chris, who's coming in here later today, is the president, so, I'm not, once I was gone, I was gone. Yeah. I left. I didn't hang around. But I am still involved. I'm chairing the fundraising to raise 30 million to build the Museum of Architecture. Yeah. So the idea of the House of Architecture was to say 66 needs to become accessible, open to the publics. So we're doing that with a cafe and a shop and a bar, so the public will come in. The collection that we've pushed away to the V&A, we're bringing back together and putting that into what we're going to call the working title, the Museum of Architecture, which we will put somewhere in London, probably under a Section 106, because we'll get a good deal. And then there'll be the archive, and there'll be the digitization of the collection. So the 4 million objects will be freely available around the world. So I'm chairing the fundraising for that project and kind of steeped in it. I'm not involved in the great work, Chris and his predecessor have done, and their successors. But this House of Architecture idea, which is what the RIBA is supposed to be doing, is coming to fruition. So I'm quite enjoying that time. I'm enjoying it more than when I was there.
Were there any conversations you had with your two following presidents to warn them or to encourage them?
I met with my successor, who I got on very well with. I saw Chris for breakfast before when he was standing. I always said, you're your own people. You'll do it your own way. My only advice is, it's a long haul, and don't make any enemies. You'll make them naturally. Just get on and be yourself and do your thing, which both of them did, really, really well. And I think, that it's an encouraging era.
So now looking forward, AHMM have just introduced a new series of executive directors alongside the original 4. How do you see this moving? I mean, obviously AHMM have grown to a very large practice. Yeah. You've obviously been involved with the RIBA. Is there a moving forward in the sort of next generation? And how do you kind of, let go of something that, you built?
I mean, I found it easy to let go of the RIBA to Moiwa, and he did a great job. That was no problem at all. I'm not letting go of AHMM. I don't mean that in a bad way. The new executive directors, there are 7 of them, have all been with us for between 10 and 20 odd years, longer in one case. So what we've done is we became an EOT when we were 55. We'll be approaching a decade on from there. We're not there yet. What we've said is none of us are retiring, but the strength and breadth of AHMM needs to be represented into the future. And even if I was to say till I was 75, actually you need that transitional next generation in much earlier. So they're all experienced hands. They've joined the board. They were all directors. They were all leading projects. They're all architects, importantly. They have different skill sets between them, but they are all running teams, which is one of our rules, that they must be people who can win projects, make good architecture, and lead people. They're leaders. So I think what we're doing is we're bringing them on board. It's possible that one of them might retire before one of us because they're not that far apart. It's possible others will come in. But I think it's an exciting transition and really important. And I think, you had Mark Middleton and Grimshaw did that really well. They're a very successful office. Nick, retired, stepped back, then retired, recently sadly passed away. But that office is buoyant. And in a way, you can't control life beyond, your time in a business. But if you're in that practice, you want that practice to be good and fun and led by people who you get on with. Sure. So in a way, it's kind of, we've always said we need to build a next generation who are really talented and committed people, and luckily, I think we have.
And with that in mind, you've obviously, it feels like the practice has these principles, and even from your projects at the beginning at the Bartlett sort of thing, that approach of letting people be the best in what they are, give them agency, but also have this sort of collective nature. It feels like you're doing the same, this many years on.
Yeah, I mean, look, Paul and I lead studios. We are quite opinionated about architecture. We're pretty engaged with architecture. But the rule we had going back to when we were students is the best idea wins. Not your idea or my idea, but the best idea. And that still stands. And that thing I said about crits, about, if everyone's comfortable, it's probably not very good. You need to be continuously challenging and pushing it on. And I think the idea is that this next generation, who are long-term collaborators and colleagues, in a sense, part of their training now will be on the board, thinking about the other bigger strategic issues that might come and hit us. In the end, as a practice, we can look at, we have an office in America, we have an office in Sydney, we have an office in Madrid, and those offices have different relationships with London. Only America's represented on the board because that's the biggest office. But even now, you're thinking about, we can't just rely on the UK. It's interesting to work abroad culturally. It gives you different balances and cycles. We're an international office. London's an international city. When people leave, they go somewhere else that we might get engaged with work there. We don't want to open lots of offices around the world. We still want to be in one place. But a continuous review of that goes on all the time to say, what is the best atmosphere to make the best architecture?
Yeah, you're having those conversations. So we've spoken about that generation of architecture, and obviously AHMM are also involved heavily with your summer school, which is very well regarded within the industry. And again, your involvement with things like London School of Architecture and obviously the teaching. What do you see as the benefit and the real opportunity for a practice like AHMM to get involved in something like the summer school and show, well, not only provide those opportunities for young people, but also kind of highlight what we do and maybe adding a new gateway for people into the profession?
We ran a program a few years ago with Arabs and a night Harwood, which was Step Into My Shoes. We went into a school and we said, this is the construction industry. So we've always been interested in promoting the construction industry rather than architecture. Because if you promote architecture, it's slightly like a needle in a haystack to find an architect. But if you say that there's an amazing industry out there, and don't forget, a lot of architects go into other industries, there's a kind of training here, but there's an amazing industry that's quite interesting, rich and creative. And so I think first thing is to encourage people in a collaborative way with our peers, with whom we work, engineers, clients, other designers, and say, that's the construction industry. You should think about this industry as a career, a creative career built around the built environment. Our summer schools are much more about architecture, which is kind of, as we discussed earlier, seen as somewhat glamorous by the next generation.
That's still a thing, is it?
Yeah, well, by school leavers, not necessarily by young architects, but it's seen as glamorous from televisual representation. But I think that is very much about getting people who would not get into an architect's office, having some fun. Even if they never touch architecture again, they're likely to change the way they look at the world in a way. And that's a great thing. We have had, examples of people who've actually come to that summer school, end up working for us, end up being employed, end up being, graduates, end up, moving on or staying. But the real thing is you're kind of building a bit like the idea of the House of Architects. You're building a kind of a cohort of people who appreciate that there's a whole thing going on that they never saw before. And I've always said to someone, if you study architecture and never get involved in architecture, the way you look at the world will be enriched because you'll always be looking around you, seeing how things are done, changing, being changed, how people are living. It's a kind of anthropological study of walking around the city or the town or the village.
Yeah, I think that's really lovely, and it's that opportunity to touch something a little bit closer to have that effect on you. I mean, it even makes me think about my work experience working for Calford Seedon in Orpington for I think I was 15, designing a dentist surgery with my colouring pencils, and then coming back and telling my mum I was sure that they were going to use my design for the dentist surgery. And even like you say, just touching something like that, having being able to see behind the curtain into something and having that effect on someone to how they experience the world is a very.
And some, like you, will go on to be an architect, but others won't.
Yeah,
but they might well end up one day commissioning architecture or being a spokesperson for it in that difficult public consultation or whatever it might be. It's also, I think, to be very clear, it's rewarding for the people who do the mentoring. They enjoy that conversation with the next generation. So it's not like giving, it's an exchange across time with another generation.
And thinking about that next generation coming forward, obviously they will be entering, even graduates now are entering a world which, I asked all the guests about this AI question and everyone has different opinions. Everyone, half of my guests are very for it, half are, quaking in their boots and, how things will change. But, the inevitability of change and how students will be entering the workplace, how do you personally see it, or how do the practice sort of grasp or adapt themselves with
so I'm not heavily engaged with the use of AI. So if I write an article, I write it myself. I don't put
the
it
old-fashioned
through.
way.
I don't put it through ChatGPT. I am on. There's the Fora Institute of Work, and I sit and have dinner once every 2 months with some interesting people like Andy Haldane, the ex advisor of the Bank of England, talking about what this will do. And there's people from Google and OpenAI there, as well as from Fora. There's lots of, so I'm involved in an interesting conversation about the theory of AI. I'm not involved in the reality, but from my personal experience, I see my kids, my 3 teenage daughters, getting ChatGPT to organize their thoughts. And my concern about that is I joke that I'm the one who should use AI because I'm long enough in the tooth to be critical of what it offers. So, I mean, AI, 1, it's the prompt that matters, that informs it. 2, don't take it as the truth, because it might be completely wrong in some things. But the main danger I see to the human condition is actually turning off the muscles in your brain. There was a very interesting podcast I heard recently, and I'm not big on podcasts, but this guy said, a student said, I think, I just can't write it down. And the professor said, if you can't write it down, you can't think it. We use words and text as a way of organizing ideas. And the danger, a bit like, the more I use Waze, the less I know my way around London. The more you use AI, the less you're able to organize your ideas. The line from the office is, extraordinarily powerful tool. We can use it to test generations of plans and things we're doing. But also the other line is it's stealing all our IP. And it's a bit like a kind of drug dealer selling you crack cocaine. It's cheap initially, and then it'll become very, very expensive. So it's clearly something that's going to have a huge impact on what we do. Will it replace the ability to think? Only if we allow it to. The creative process of thinking, the turning of things upside down, the finding of what I think architecture is understanding the real challenge that exists in the project, not the one you're told, and where the opportunity to be transformative is. I'm not sure that AI will readily replace that skill set, but it's a bit like the computer that's grown during my career from a huge room and a massive machine to a tiny chip and everyone having one. I'm sure it'll be transformative. I'm optimistic that the human condition and creativity will remain hugely relevant as long as we retain the creativity. The concern I have is it will dull our brains rather than enlarge our opportunities.
All the conversations we've had about the value of the architect is that critical thinking thing. Is that it's not the drawing of the plans. It's not the XYZ that can come out of these tools. It is that thinking, that skill, that ability to take something and look at it in different ways and understand context. And I think it's obviously it's something that's on everybody's lips. It's people get fascinated with and very excited about, but
it's going to be transformative.
Yeah.
I just don't know quite how yet.
Yeah.
And maybe we can use it to our advantage. It's what we should be aiming to do.
Looking back now then, so go back to 28-year-old Simon at the start of you four coming together. Are there, I suppose, is there a piece of advice that you'd give yourself, or are there any warnings that you'd give yourself?
I'm like a lot of architects, I'm an optimist.
Yeah, I think you have
and
to
I kind of think you you have to sort of believe in where you're going and what you're doing. I think I always knew it would be tough, but I also think, if you hold that belief and you're trying to do something, I think what kept us going was the idea that we could build really good buildings for the city around us, and that creative process would be hugely rewarding and uplifting personally, and ideally, you talked about financially too, but it's the combination of those things. So in a sense, all I'd have said was, as I say to youngsters, the first 5 years are the toughest. You've got to learn how to survive those first 5 years. Once you've survived, you can flourish. But it is a I wouldn't use the word a battle. It is a struggle to survive, but it's worth it. But it's almost like it's like the test of whether you've got the energy for it. So no different advice. I might have said, if I'd said to us, we used to joke we'd never been more than 20 people, 30 people. If I'd said we'd be who we are now, I'd have said, I don't believe that's what's going to happen. That's not the way it is. We were never worried about growth, but I'd never have believed we'd have the scale of opportunities we have. So in a sense, I said to my young self, actually, you know what? You'll be surprised. It's going to be even better than you hoped.
And then just thinking about, obviously we started the interview talking about your father. With him as an architect and then seeing how you'd progressed as an architect, two-part sort of question. What was that relationship like as you came into yourself, as you founded AHMM, as you became much more successful and wider known and did build these buildings? And also, what's the relationship like with your daughters moving forward, thinking about how they see architecture, how they see a parent as an architect?
Yeah. So, I mean, I used to joke with them, with when I was a young architect, I wanted to talk about football. My father wanted to talk about architecture.
Yeah.
Then I wanted to talk about architecture and he wanted to talk about football. He retired the week we opened by chance, just purely by chance. Yeah. And he used to pop in the office, and he'd run a very large office, and he enjoyed being in a very small office. And he loved the studio office that we were in. And he gave us our first project, which was a pool house in his garden. So he was a great client and friend to all of us, obviously most especially to me. But he died when I think we were 6-7 years into practice. But he knew we'd won Walsall bus station.
Sure.
He knew we were doing good things. He could see it. So, but he was always in the background, a great kind. He'd maybe take us out for lunch or buy us drinks when we were a bit low or whatever it might be. Yeah. So he was a kind of
he
great.
Understood the sort of...
And he also was very good on the project he gave us to design this house for him, which obviously I led the design of. He was very good at acting as a client and not acting as an architect, which was quite a good lesson to learn. Now I can see things in his work. I can even discover buildings he's done where almost subliminally I might have absorbed some influences, which now he's 30 years dead. I enjoy the idea of my father, the architect, really nice. Whereas historically I would be, distancing myself from him. With my daughters, it's quite interesting. I doubt they'll listen to this podcast because they're 15 and 13. But the 13-year-old is a art scholar at her school. And she told her mum, and she draws all the time and draws very beautifully. She told her mum, I think I want to be an architect, but don't tell him. So, my wife said, don't even mention it because she knows, because she's her mother, apple of her mother's eye, and I'm the dreadful father. Don't tell him. In fact, when we went to America, we did a little road trip and we stopped in our Oklahoma office and Wade and Dan drove us around all the projects. And I said to Orla, what do you think of the project? She goes, it's better than you're doing in London, Dad. So like all kids, she's pretty dismissive. But I think there's an architectural thing there, but I'm not going to encourage it. Like with my father, if it comes, it comes.
Yeah, I try and convince my daughter to watch this podcast and she rolls her eyes at me. Yeah, we'll see. Simon, that was an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure, absolute pleasure. Really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.